A sealed document compiled by Prince William had reached King Charles's hands late one evening, delivered privately by a trusted aide with instructions that no one else was to open it. By the time Charles finished reading its final page, his relationship with Queen Camilla had already shifted in ways that could not be undone, not gradually, not over weeks, but in the space of a single night. What the document contained was specific, methodical, and independently verifiable across multiple sources. And what it described had been building quietly inside palace walls for months, right beneath the king's notice, in a place he had never thought to look. Before we get into exactly what that report uncovered, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss a story like this one. The details the headlines skipped are precisely where this gets interesting. But to understand why William felt compelled to write that report at all, we need to go back to a moment that almost no one noticed, because the story didn't begin with an envelope. It began with a staff transfer that seemed, on the surface, entirely unremarkable. A trusted aide entered the king's private study sometime around 9:30 in the evening, carrying a manila envelope that had not come through any standard palace channel. Charles had already dismissed his staff for the night. He was alone. The aide placed the envelope on the desk, explained that Prince William had sent specific instructions for private delivery, and left without another word. Charles sat looking at it for a moment before picking it up. It was heavier than a casual letter. William's personal wax seal was pressed into the back, marked, clearly, for the king's eyes only. That isn't even the most striking part. What made that envelope significant was not what it contained, it was the fact that William had chosen to send it this way at all. Not a phone call, not a quiet conversation over dinner, not a request for a private meeting. A sealed, formally delivered, personally authenticated document, sent after dark, with instructions that no one else was to handle it. When a son sends his father something like that, the father already knows, before opening it, that whatever is inside required more than words spoken aloud. Charles broke the seal. The document inside was substantial, multiple pages, structured in sections, written with the kind of deliberate organization that signals someone who understood their audience would need to verify everything they were about to read. The introduction did not begin with accusations. It began with an acknowledgement. William wrote about the difficulty of what he was doing, the tension between family loyalty and duty to the institution, the weight of choosing to put something like this in writing at all. He was not asking Charles to simply take his word for it. He was asking Charles to check. He wrote that every claim inside could be confirmed through independent sources, and he meant it as an instruction, not a reassurance. Charles read slowly. There was a particular moment, somewhere in the middle of the report, when he stopped reading entirely, stood up, and walked to the window. He stood there for a while, looking out at the palace grounds in the dark, not moving. Then he went back to his desk and kept reading. The document described patterns of behavior that had been unfolding over several months. Specific incidents, specific people, specific decisions. Things that had happened within the same walls Charles walked through every day. Things that had happened, in some cases, in rooms adjacent to his own. He finished reading sometime around midnight. He did not call anyone. He did not send a response to William. He locked the report inside his desk drawer, sat in the silence of his study, and remained there long after the palace had gone quiet around him. The woman he had spent decades fighting to have accepted, the woman who now carried the title of Queen Consort, had been doing something he had never anticipated. But before he could confront any of it, he needed to know whether what William had written was true. And the answer to that question was already sitting on a shelf across the room. Charles had kept detailed personal journals for years. Not official records, those existed separately, maintained by staff and archived according to protocol. These were his own, written in his own hand, recording impressions and observations that never appeared in any briefing document or public account. Small things, mostly. The texture of particular days, conversations that lingered, moments that felt significant without yet being explainable. He had filled shelf after shelf of them across decades, and he had never imagined he would one day need them the way he needed them now. He did not sleep that night. The following morning, before any aide had arrived, before any scheduled engagement had begun, Charles pulled the journals from the shelf and opened the first one that covered the relevant period. He was not reading for pleasure or reflection. He was reading the way an investigator reads, looking for the small detail that confirms or contradicts, the offhand notation that suddenly carries an entirely different weight when read against new information. He opened William's report beside him and began working through the timeline, cross-referencing every claim against his own private record of the same months. And what he found did not reassure him. The entries were not dramatic. That was precisely the point. They were quiet observations, notations about days when palace operations had felt slightly off. Mornings when staff members had seemed hesitant in ways he had not been able to identify at the time, evenings when Camilla had steered a conversation away from a particular subject and he had let it go without thinking twice. Each entry, read alone, meant almost nothing. Read against what William had documented, they formed something else entirely. A sequence, a pattern, evidence, recorded in his own handwriting, of things he had witnessed without understanding what he was witnessing. There was one entry in particular that stopped him. He had noted a morning in October when he asked Camilla directly about the transfer of a senior household manager, someone who had served the palace for the better part of 2 decades. Camilla had explained it simply. The person had wanted reduced responsibilities before retirement. Charles had recorded that explanation without comment, without question, without any notation of doubt. He had accepted it completely. What he understood now, sitting with the journals open in front of him, was that he had never actually spoken with the household manager in question. He had received one account, from one source, and moved on. Camilla had inserted herself as the sole interpreter of someone else's decision, and Charles had not noticed. He kept going through the entries. Page after page, the same pattern emerged. Advisors who had seemed oddly reluctant to speak freely. Briefings that arrived unusually condensed, with recommendations already attached, leaving little room for him to form his own conclusions. Scheduling arrangements that had seemed, at the time, like practical helpfulness, but that now looked like a careful management of his attention. Charles had interpreted all of it as partnership. He understood now that he had been reading the wrong story entirely, and that the correct one had been sitting in his own handwriting all along. William had not compiled that report in a single sitting. He had not woken up one morning and decided to document his stepmother's behavior out of impulse or grievance. What eventually became a sealed envelope on the king's desk had begun months earlier as something far quieter, a private unease that William could not immediately name, attached to a single incident that most people inside the palace had barely registered. It started with a staff transfer. A senior household manager, someone who had spent nearly 2 decades coordinating daily operations between Charles and Camilla, managing schedules, overseeing logistics, serving as a point of continuity between the personal and institutional sides of palace, life had quietly requested a move to a minor administrative position. The request came without fanfare, processed through normal channels, approved without difficulty. From the outside, it looked like a routine personnel matter. People adjusted roles, responsibilities shifted. It happened regularly in large institutions. William found it strange. Not loudly strange, not immediately alarming, just wrong in a way he could not fully articulate at first, because this particular person had an exemplary record, genuine institutional knowledge, and no obvious reason to voluntarily step away from a position they had held with distinction for years. So William did what came naturally to him. When something did not add up, he made quiet inquiries. Discreet conversations, careful questions asked through trusted intermediaries. What came back troubled him considerably. Camilla had called the household manager into a private meeting some days before the transfer request was submitted. The meeting had been informal in tone but pointed in content. She had questioned the manager's loyalty not directly, not with accusations, but in the way that makes a direct accusation unnecessary. She had suggested that certain members of staff seemed more devoted to preserving established ways of doing things than to embracing her vision for how the household should operate. She had implied, with the kind of careful language that leaves no quotable sentence behind, that people who could not adapt to her preferred approach might find the environment increasingly uncomfortable. The household manager left that meeting feeling distinctly threatened. Within days, they had requested reassignment. William kept watching. Over the following weeks, 2 additional cases emerged, each following an almost identical sequence. Both involved long-serving palace employees, people with deep institutional knowledge, strong professional records, and years of experience managing sensitive royal operations. Both had found themselves in private conversations with Camilla that left them feeling undermined and uncertain about their futures. Both subsequently requested transfers to positions with significantly reduced responsibility. 3 people, 3 conversations with Camilla, 3 requests for demotion. Individually, each could be explained. A personality conflict, a desire for change, the ordinary friction of a large household adjusting to new leadership. But William had now spoken to enough people, carefully enough, to understand that what he was looking at was not friction. It was a method, and methods have purposes. The question William had not yet answered, the one that made him start writing things down, was what, exactly, this particular method was designed to achieve. The positions those 3 experienced staff members vacated did not remain empty for long. That was the detail William had not anticipated, and the one that transformed his concern into something he felt the king absolutely needed to see. Because the people brought in to fill those roles did not come through standard palace recruitment. They did not carry the kind of professional background typically required for positions this sensitive. What they shared, across every case William examined, was something far more specific than a resume. They were personally loyal to Camilla, not to the institution, not to the crown, to her, and once they were in place, things began to change. William documented regular meetings Camilla held with this group inside her private apartment, scheduled, with notable consistency, during periods when Charles was occupied with engagements elsewhere in the palace. The meetings were not announced through official channels. They did not appear on any shared calendar. Attendees were encouraged to see themselves as part of a modernization effort led by the Queen Consort, and the atmosphere cultivated inside those rooms was one of exclusive membership, the sense that being included meant something, and being excluded meant something too. What came out of those meetings began reshaping how the palace actually functioned. Decisions that had traditionally required consultation with senior advisors started moving through informal channels instead. Staff members who raised questions about proper procedures found themselves quietly sidelined from future discussions. A culture of hesitation developed. People stopped following established protocols with confidence because doing so might, in ways they could not always predict, displease the Queen Consort. Institutional knowledge that had guided palace operations across multiple reigns was being dismissed, consistently and deliberately, as outdated thinking standing in the way of progress. Then came the financial irregularities. Budget allocations for Camilla's office had increased substantially across the relevant period, not through any approved process, not with the documentation that palace financial procedures required, but through arrangements that bypassed normal oversight entirely. When administrators responsible for fiscal accountability asked questions, Camilla's new staff provided answers so vague they functioned as non-answers. The amounts involved were not enormous, but the pattern of avoiding transparency was not accidental. Accidental oversights look different. They leave traces of attempted compliance. These left traces of something else. The most significant finding came last. Camilla had begun intercepting communications before they reached Charles. Correspondence from trusted advisors, briefings from department heads, updates on matters the king would ordinarily have reviewed directly. She had positioned herself between Charles and that information flow, reviewing material first and deciding, on his behalf, what he actually needed to see. She described this to staff as helpful. She framed it as protecting the king's time and attention from unnecessary detail. What it actually did was ensure that Charles understood the palace through a version of events she had already shaped. William had not written the report out of personal grievance. He had written it because what he had documented was not a personality overstepping its boundaries. It was a structure, built carefully, piece by piece. And structures do not build themselves. Charles did not confront Camilla. That is the part worth sitting with, because it tells you something important about how he chose to respond and what he understood the situation to actually require. A man operating from emotion would have walked into the next room and demanded an explanation. A man operating from institution would do something else entirely. He would remove the conditions that made the problem possible. He would rebuild the architecture around it. And that is precisely what Charles did. The instructions went through his private secretary. New protocols were established without announcement and without fanfare. All significant decisions across palace departments would now require Charles's personal written authorization before implementation. No changes to staffing, budgeting, or operational procedures could proceed without a formal proposal submitted directly to the king's office and reviewed there. The layers of oversight that Camilla's informal arrangements had been quietly bypassing were not just restored. They were reinforced in ways that made future bypassing structurally impossible. An advisory council was formed. William was included prominently. So were several long-serving counselors whose institutional experience and personal loyalty to the crown were beyond question, people who had watched the previous months with growing unease, and who now found themselves returned to the center of palace decision-making with a quiet but unmistakable sense of relief. The council met regularly in the king's private study. Attendance was strictly controlled. The agenda covered all major palace operations and upcoming royal activities. Camilla's name did not appear on the membership roster. She was not informed that the council existed. Staff adapted immediately, as palace staff always do when the center of gravity shifts, not because anyone told them explicitly what had happened, but because the signals were clear enough that experienced professionals did not require explanation. Documents and requests that had previously moved through both the king's office and the queen consort's office now moved exclusively through Charles's. Departments that had grown accustomed to navigating Camilla's informal channels found those channels simply no longer functioning. The flow of information inside the palace reoriented itself almost overnight. The way water finds a new path when the old one closes, the machinery had begun moving. What made this response so complete and so deliberate was precisely what it lacked. There was no confrontation, no accusation delivered face to face, no dramatic moment that Camilla could respond to, defend herself against, or reframe in her own terms. The institutional correction happened around her, not to her, in a language she could observe but not directly address. Charles had understood something that William's report had clarified without needing to state it explicitly, that the problem had never been personal, it had been structural. And structural problems do not require arguments. They require new structures. Camilla discovered the changed transportation arrangements when a member of her staff informed her that her car would be departing 15 minutes after the king's for an engagement they were both attending. She was not given a reason. There was not one offered. The palace had already moved on to what came next. The separation did not announce itself all at once. It arrived the way serious things often do inside palace walls, incrementally, through small adjustments that individually seemed administrative but collectively communicated something irreversible. Each change detail added weight to the one before it, and by the time the full picture became visible, there was no single moment anyone could point to as the beginning. There was only the accumulated reality of what had quietly stopped happening. The transportation arrangements were the first visible sign. Then Charles moved his personal belongings. He relocated to a separate wing of the palace that had previously served as guest quarters, offering an explanation to staff that he required uninterrupted space for sensitive matters, demanding his full concentration. The framing was reasonable. Nobody questioned it aloud, but staff who had spent years navigating the unspoken grammar of royal domestic life understood immediately that this was not a temporary arrangement made for practical convenience. The king was not seeking quiet, he was establishing distance. And distance, once established in a palace, tends to become permanent. The evening briefings disappeared next. Charles and Camilla had shared a routine reviewing the following day's schedule together, coordinating their separate engagements, maintaining the kind of practical partnership that makes two people's public roles function as one coherent unit. Those sessions ended without explanation. Charles began receiving his updates alone in his study. Decisions were made without her input. Staff adjusted their reporting procedures accordingly, directing information that had previously gone to both offices now exclusively through the king's. The charitable foundations followed. Several boards that Charles and Camilla had co-chaired were quietly restructured. Her name was removed from leadership positions on a number of them, not all at once, but steadily, in the kind of gradual sequence that avoids generating a single headline while achieving a total result. Responsibilities she had held were reassigned to other family members. Revised organizational charts appeared in official palace communications. Camilla learned of some of these changes the same way outside observers did, by seeing documentation that had already been finalized without her knowledge or participation. Their mutual social circle contracted around her. Friends who had regularly appeared at private dinners and weekend gatherings began declining invitations or citing scheduling conflicts with increasing frequency. Charles had indicated quietly to certain people that he preferred, for the time being, to maintain distance from his wife in informal settings. The conversations that would previously have included her stopped including her. The rooms she had moved through with confidence became rooms where she now sensed, without anyone saying anything directly, that her presence was being merely tolerated rather than genuinely welcomed. Each of these changes, documented individually, might have seemed like the ordinary friction of a complicated life. Together they described something with no ambiguity at all. Charles was not creating space. He was not working through something privately before returning to a shared center. He was removing Camilla, carefully and completely, from every layer of the life they had built together, one change detail at a time, until almost nothing remained. Camilla had tried to make sense of it quietly at first. She told herself Charles was preoccupied that the weight of state business occasionally pulled him into a kind of concentrated distance that was not personal, not directed, not something requiring a response from her. She had seen versions of it before across the years they had spent together. She knew the rhythm of a man who carried enormous institutional responsibility, and sometimes needed to carry it alone. She extended that explanation as far as it would reach. It did not reach far enough. She wrote him a letter, not a formal communication through palace channels, a personal one, written by hand, expressing confusion about the growing distance between them. She described sensing that something had changed and asked for the opportunity to understand what she had done wrong. She referenced the years they had navigated together, the difficulties they had survived, the partnership she believed they had built. She wrote carefully, without accusation, without defensiveness, in the tone of someone genuinely trying to reach another person across a silence they did not yet understand. Charles's response arrived 2 days later. It was a single typed paragraph. It stated that he would communicate any necessary information through appropriate channels. Nothing more. No acknowledgement of what she had written, no gesture toward the personal register in which she had written it. The coldness of that reply, its absolute refusal to meet her where she had placed herself, told her more than any explanation would have. She read it several times. Then she set it down and sat with what it meant. She tried again. A second letter, more specific this time, asking direct questions, suggesting a quiet weekend away from palace obligations, describing particular moments from their past that she felt still held meaning. She wrote about hope. She wrote about the possibility that whatever had come between them could be addressed if they were simply given space to speak honestly. She sent it through the same private channel and waited. His response stated that his schedule would not permit personal travel in the foreseeable future. She reached out to William. A request for a private meeting arrived at his office through proper family channels. She framed it as a conversation about family matters, careful not to reveal how much she already sensed about the shape of what was happening. William's office responded after several days with a politely worded note, explaining that his schedule was extremely full with upcoming commitments. The refusal was correct in tone and impossible to challenge. It was also unmistakable in what it communicated. Camilla was not simply navigating distance from Charles. She was navigating something that had already moved beyond him. She began having difficulty sleeping. She would lie awake in the hours before dawn, replaying months of small moments in her mind, searching for the exact point where everything had turned, for the mistake she must have made, for something concrete enough to address. What she could not yet see was that the thing she was searching for had never been hers to find alone. The palace had managed the internal reality with considerable discipline. No statement had been issued. No briefing had been given. No official channel had acknowledged that anything had changed. And yet the people whose professional lives are built around watching royals in public, the photographers who track body language across hundreds of appearances, the royal correspondents who have spent decades learning to read what is not said, had begun noticing things that did not fit the established pattern. It started with the arrivals. Events that would previously have featured coordinated entrances, Charles and Camilla emerging together, acknowledged together, photographed together as a unit, were now producing something different. Separate cars, separate timings, a gap between one entrance and the next that was too consistent to be logistical and too deliberate to be accidental. Photographers caught it first because photographers always do. Then the footage made its way onto evening broadcasts where presenters noted the change carefully, without attribution. In the measured language of people describing something they can see but cannot yet fully explain. The commentary followed quickly. Royal correspondents who had spent years covering the relationship between Charles and Camilla began filing pieces about a visible shift in the dynamic between them. The language was cautious, words like distance and tension and apparent strain appearing in paragraphs that stopped short of drawing explicit conclusions. But the accumulation of those cautious observations across multiple outlets and multiple appearances created an impression no single article could manufacture alone. Something had changed. Enough people were saying it, in enough different ways, that the question moved from the margins of royal coverage into its center. Experts began appearing on television. Constitutional historians, royal biographers, former palace advisors, people with genuine knowledge of how the institution functions when relationships at its core fracture, were invited onto programs to discuss what the visible signs might indicate. They spoke in careful terms about precedent and protocol, and the particular way royal households communicate internal reality through external choreography. None of them had access to William's report. None of them knew about the sealed envelope or the private diaries or the advisory council or the charitable board restructuring. But they could read a walking order, and what they read in the walking orders told them enough. International media amplified everything. European royal correspondents, American outlets that track the British monarchy as a form of ongoing cultural spectacle, broadcasters across multiple continents all picked up the thread and pulled it in their own directions. Public debate opened across social media and opinion pages simultaneously. Some voices defended Camilla, arguing that the visible distance reflected nothing more than the ordinary tension of two people managing enormous public obligations under immense pressure. Others read the same images and drew entirely different conclusions. The private decision had become a national conversation. Charles had not planned for this. The palace never plans for the moment when internal reality outpaces institutional control. It simply arrives in a photograph, in a walking order, in the gap between two cars pulling up to the same building at different times, and after that, the story belongs to everyone. There are moments in royal life when the institution communicates without speaking. When the arrangement of bodies in a room, the sequence of arrivals at a doorway, the precise distance between two people standing for a photograph, when all of these things carry more meaning than any official statement ever could. People who study the monarchy understand this grammar fluently. They have spent years learning to read what is being said through what is being shown. And at a formal state event held in the weeks following everything that had quietly unfolded inside palace walls, what was being shown required no translation at all. Charles and William arrived together. That detail alone was noticed, not because it was unprecedented, but because of how it felt against the backdrop of everything that had been accumulating: the separate cars, the reduced calendar, the restructured foundations, the advisory council whose membership told its own story. Father and son, arriving as a coordinated unit, carried a weight that a simple joint arrival would not ordinarily carry. Their posture as they moved through the entrance was easy, unhurried, the posture of two people who had been spending considerable time in each other's company and had grown comfortable there. Camilla arrived separately. She entered through the correct door at the correct time, dressed appropriately, carrying herself with the composure that decades of public life had made second nature to her. She greeted the people she was expected to greet. She moved to her assigned position without visible hesitation. Everything she did was proper. Everything she did was correct. And every person in that room who understood the grammar of royal appearances could see, with complete clarity, that she was fulfilling a role rather than occupying a place. The seating arrangements confirmed it. The configuration placed Charles at the center of the principal gathering, with William positioned close enough to suggest genuine consultation. The physical proximity of people who share information, who lean slightly toward each other when something requires quiet acknowledgement, who exist within the same decision-making radius. Camilla sat at a remove that was not insulting, not dramatic, not anything a camera could frame as a snub. It was simply accurate. It reflected, in the precise spatial language of formal occasions, exactly where she now stood in relation to the center of things. A photographer caught one particular moment. Charles and William in candid exchange, not posed, not arranged, not performing for the lens, simply two men in brief, quiet conversation, their heads angled slightly toward each other in the unconscious way that signals genuine trust between people. The image required no caption. It told the entire story of what had shifted and who had moved closer as something else had moved away. Camilla, visible in the background of that same frame, was speaking with a guest, smiling correctly, present in every technical sense, and entirely alone in the only sense that, inside an institution built on proximity to power, actually mattered. Nobody needed to say what had happened. The room had already said it. Months passed. The palace settled into its new shape quietly, without ceremony, the way institutions always do when a significant internal shift has been absorbed into daily routine. The drama that might have existed in a different kind of story never arrived. There was no public confrontation, no announcement, no moment of official reckoning that gave the outside world something clean to point to. There was simply the gradual solidification of a reality that had already been decided, in a private study, on a night when a sealed envelope changed everything. Charles had not recovered what he lost. He had replaced it with something else. The hope he had carried for so long to have Camilla genuinely accepted, to build a partnership that served both the crown and their private life equally, to demonstrate that what they had survived together had been worth the cost that hope had not survived the report. What replaced it was a kind of concentrated resolve. He channeled the disappointment inward and the energy outward into the duties that remained regardless of everything else, into the institution that required his attention, precisely because it did not pause for personal devastation. Personal happiness had become a secondary consideration. He had made peace with that, in the way that people make peace with things they cannot change and have stopped expecting to. William carried something heavier than satisfaction. He had done what he believed was necessary. He did not doubt that, but necessity and comfort exist in entirely different registers, and what William lived with in the aftermath was the quiet weight of knowing that his report had altered his father's marriage, reshaped his family's internal landscape, and produced consequences that extended far beyond the institutional corrections he had intended to trigger. He had acted out of duty, Duty, when it costs something real, does not feel like victory. It feels like exactly what it is. Camilla had arrived at a particular kind of understanding. She had chosen, in the end, passive acceptance over public conflict, understanding that any attempt to fight back openly would destroy the careful rehabilitation of decades and leave her with nothing. Her title remained. Her apartments remained. Her public calendar continued. And none of it meant what it had meant before. She existed in a form of limbo that had no clean name in any royal precedent she could find present. Correct, technically unchanged, and entirely without the influence or connection that had made the position worth anything beyond its formal definition. The long-serving staff felt something close to relief, though they would not have used that word aloud. The institution had protected itself. That was the true ending, not the personal stories of the people involved, but the fact that something older and larger than any of them had registered a threat, corrected for it, and continued. The crown does not grieve. It adjusts. William's report did not create the problem. It revealed it. And what it revealed about Camilla's choices, about Charles's blind spots, about the fragile distance between a functioning partnership and a managed performance, was a truth the palace had already been living with long before anyone put it in writing.